the industry is still reeling from the recent announcement that Irrational Games will cease to exist as we now know them. The majority of the staff has been let go, and the few that remain will join Ken Levine's new team with a focus on small, narrative-driven games. Over the past 15 plus years, the studio has produced numerous critically acclaimed games and was recognized among the industry's best at creating amazingly realized game worlds and compelling storylines. With games like System Shock 2, Freedom Force, and SWAT 4 on the studio's resume, many people have different opinions about which is their favorite Irrational game, but few would argue the defining Irrational developed titles are without a doubt Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite. Let's break these two games down and determine which is Irrational's finest Bioshock game, and perhaps the studio's crowning achievement. Just a warning, spoilers for both of these games will follow.
The artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
Some things change, but there's always a lighthouse, a man, and a city, and these things have come to define what a Bioshock game is. Though the themes, characters, and even time period differ between each of these games, the most significant thing they share in common are imaginative, detailed, and often awe-inspiring central locations. Bioshock takes place in the underwater city of Rapture, an objectivist utopia founded on the ideals of free market and scientific advancement without moral constraints. Bioshock Infinite is set in Columbia, a floating city that is meant to represent the ideal America of the early 20th century. The first moment you set your eyes upon Rapture is breathtaking. As your bathysphere comes upon the city, the Art Deco design and sprawling cityscape are something to behold. Once you actually enter Rapture, you'll find the city in disarray after an upheaval a year or so prior, and making your way through the ruins of this once great metropolis is among the game's major strengths. The many locations within Rapture are strikingly detailed, and you'll believe it could have been a real place. Rapture benefits greatly from a feeling of consistency. Every aspect of the city feels like it was put there for a reason, and as you explore the finer details of every scene, it becomes clear just how much care and effort was put into crafting Rapture. In many ways, Columbia is the polar opposite to Rapture. Whereas Rapture was based upon the notion of no gods or kings, only man, Columbia stands very much for God and country. Though it seceded from the Union decades prior, Columbia is a picture of turn-of-the-century Americana. It's still in its prime during Bioshock Infinite, so the game shows more of a glimpse of everyday life at times, rather than the ruins we find Rapture in. However, this does somewhat break the cohesion of the city as well, because many of the mechanics and scenarios the game presents don't make a whole lot of sense in what is supposed to be a thriving city. Aside from that, Columbia is just as detailed as Rapture, a place that exhibits the extremes of both the best and worst of America in that era. At the end of the day, Rapture is a more memorable city than Columbia. Both of these settings are among the best video games have to offer, but nagging issues and a lack of world consistency hurt Columbia in the end. Many aspects of it feel disjointed, like the idea of the Founding Fathers being deified, which is presented early in the game and then never referenced again. Figures also present a problem, and though their origin is adequately explained, the mere presence and availability of figures in this type of society doesn't gel with everything else about Columbia. Every new area of Rapture you come across feels entirely appropriate, and the fact that the city is in shambles makes the game mechanics feel more consistent with the world, which is not something Infinite excels at. When it's all said and done, Rapture feels like a real city, and Columbia feels more like an amusement park.
City at the bottom of the ocean. Ridiculous.
Gameplay has never been the strongest element of the Bioshock series, and in fact, the much maligned Bioshock 2 would likely win this category over both of these games, though it wouldn't stand a chance in any other area. Though the gameplay of these games shares a lot in common thematically, in practice these games play quite differently. From a pure mechanical standpoint, Infinite has a slight advantage, with the ability to dual-wield abilities and guns simultaneously, the added mobility of skylines, and improved weapon handling and aiming capability. However, apart from the mechanics being a bit better, Infinite comes up short of the original Bioshock in other areas of gameplay. The biggest shortcoming of Infinite is how uninspired the enemy encounters are. Most of the enemies in the game just shoot at you and don't offer much in the way of interesting variation. Higher tier enemies like the Patriots and Handymen mix things up a bit, but neither come anywhere near the thrills of fighting a Big Daddy. Bioshock has a much deeper combat sandbox than Infinite, and it makes the gameplay more enjoyable even with the weaker mechanics. For one, Bioshock has a wider array of abilities. Though most players will find their favorite and stick to those, having more options is better. Bioshock also gives you greater ability to experiment, with things like security cameras, combat drones, gene tonics, different ammo types, and the lack of a 2-weapon limit, giving you much more freedom to engage in combat in a wider variety of ways than you can in Infinite. Bioshock plays like a shooter with more depth and some RPG sensibilities, while Infinite plays much more like a straight-up FPS.
Who's there? Who's there?
Bring us the girl and wipe away the debt!
What do you want?
We had a deal to it! Open this door right now!
I told you! I'm not gonna do it! Go!
Along with the setting, story is probably the most important element of a Bioshock game, and both Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite have tremendous narratives. Bioshock tells the story of Jack, a survivor of a plane crash that comes upon the entrance to Rapture. Infinite stars Booker DeWitt, a man that comes to Columbia in order to retrieve a girl named Elizabeth from captivity. Both games go far beyond the premise, and by the end of each you'll be questioning what you thought you knew and trying to piece together the various clues and subtleties to determine just what really happened. Though the broad strokes of how events play out and the central character being more connected to the city than originally implied are consistent across both games, the two games tell their stories in quite different ways. Bioshock is both a subversion and a straight-up implementation of the classic silent protagonist trope, and it simultaneously illustrates the absurdity of this storytelling method while also falling into many of the common traps associated with it. Like many first-person shooters that use a silent protagonist, the majority of the game is spent simply taking orders from other characters and never questioning or even responding to them. You simply do whatever you're told. In many respects, the game doesn't differ from other games that use a silent protagonist. But the major story revelation about 2/3 of the way through the game changes the context drastically, revealing that Jack was in fact psychologically programmed to comply with any direction that accompanied the phrase, "Would you kindly," puts the events up to that point in a whole new light. However, after the revelation, the game still basically tells its story the same way, with now new characters telling you what to do without the accompanied "Would you kindly." At this point, any commentary sort of loses its edge because the game is still treading the same ground as the games it's commenting on. Apart from the "Would you kindly" stuff, the game tells an interesting story of a shadow war between Andrew Ryan and Frank Fontaine, the plight of Tenenbaum and her little sisters, and portrays a haunting image of what happens when science goes too far. With its many interesting themes and plotlines, Bioshock is among the richest story-driven shooters in existence, but the way the story is told isn't particularly amazing. Almost all the story is delivered through audio logs and radio chatter, with the Andrew Ryan confrontation being the only real significant in-engine story moment.
No, a man chooses. A slave obeys. You think you have memories. a farm, a family, an airplane, a crash, and then this place. Was there really a family? Did that airplane crash? Or was it hijacked? Forced down. Forced down by something less than a man, something bred to sleepwalk through life until they are activated by a simple phrase spoken by their kindly master.
Bioshock Infinite tells its story very differently, though it does share some similarities with the original Bioshock. The biggest difference in storytelling between these games is that Booker DeWitt has a voice, which he uses often. For a long time there was some unwritten rule that a character should never speak from a first-person perspective, but that seems to be something that is thankfully going away. The other major element of the story that is quite different from how Bioshock did things is the presence of Elizabeth. She accompanies Booker throughout the majority of the game, so almost all of the story takes place in front of the player rather than over radio. There are audio logs, but the principal story is all in-engine, which makes things feel much more meaningful. Talking to Elizabeth or the Lutece twins in person gives a much greater degree of significance to the events compared to Bioshock. Another advantage Infinite has over the original in terms of story is the very nature of the plot. Bioshock was about objectivism, science run out of control, and the dangers of extremism. And while Infinite certainly has its high-minded exploration of controversial topics like slavery, classism, and religious fundamentalism, to go along with a crazy sci-fi plot about time travel and alternate realities, the core of the game is about the relationship between a father and a daughter. By making these elements window dressing for the character-driven plot, it gives the story a more personal feeling and is something much more relatable and emotional than what Bioshock offers. It's this more personal story and improved storytelling that really sets the story of Infinite ahead of that of Bioshock.
Jesus loves me, this I know. For the Bible tells me so.
Now get me some snaps on those spider splicers, and don't come back down here till you've got my research.
Like the gameplay, the design of Bioshock allows for a much greater degree of freedom than Infinite. Though by no means an open world, the various areas of Rapture you find yourself exploring are open environments rather than linear shooting galleries. The levels feel designed first to be interesting spaces to explore that serve a clear purpose to the city, rather than simply as places for you to shoot enemies. You even have the freedom to return to previous areas whenever you want, and apart from the very last and very first area of the game, the entirety of the game world is open to you. Infinite is much more restricted and far more linear. You don't have the ability to visit previous locations, and the levels themselves are far more linear than those of Bioshock. Granted, this more focused design is a better fit for the story and pacing of Infinite than the open design of the original would have been, but the lack of freedom is still disappointing. This lack of freedom extends beyond the level design and into your ability to outfit your character. Bioshock gives you a ton of flexibility in how you want to specialize, with a huge number of gene tonics available throughout the game and up to 18 slots to assign them to. The equivalent system in Infinite is gear, of which there are far less options. Apart from the unnecessary element of randomness governing which gear you find, there are only 4 slots to be assigned. This puts much more of a limit on your ability to customize your approach, which is only compounded by the 2-weapon limit. It's this greater degree of freedom, which extends to the level design, the combat, and your ability to customize your character, that gives Bioshock the edge over Infinite in the area of design.
Would still go on, believe me. The world could show nothing to me. So what good would living do me? God only knows what I'd be without you.
Presentation is always a tough category to decide when you're looking at 2 games released over 5 years apart. As usual, I try not to let this category be decided strictly based on visual fidelity, because under those circumstances it would be no contest. The newer game would always win. From a technical standpoint, Infinite is far more impressive in nearly every way, with more detailed textures and character models, an impressive draw distance that showcases some stunning views, and more impressive animations, with Elizabeth in particular. Despite these technical advantages, Bioshock is no slouch either, and has held up remarkably well. When it first released, Bioshock was among the most beautiful games of its time, and looks a lot better today than many of its contemporaries due in large part to the strong art direction and focus on style over pure realism. Rapture's Art Deco aesthetic is still as beautiful today as when the game first came out, and even on a pure technical level the game still looks decent, which was likely achieved in 2007 thanks to the entire game consisting of interior locations. Though both games can be appreciated for their visuals, Infinite has a distinct advantage in terms of audio. The voice acting in the original was good, but the chemistry between Troy Baker as Booker and Courtney Draper as Elizabeth trumps anything in the original. Both casts are exceptional, but the two main characters of Infinite and the quirky Lutece twins really put Infinite a step ahead. In terms of music, Infinite once again comes out on top. The period music of Bioshock does a fantastic job of setting the mood and enhancing the atmosphere, but nothing can top the outstanding reinterpretations of popular music in Infinite. These anachronistic songs are among your first hints at the greater goings-on in Columbia, and every time you hear a new period rendition of a modern pop song is a real treat. You also can't forget the fantastic performance of Will the Circle Be Unbroken with Courtney Draper singing and Troy Baker on guitar.
The circle be unbroken by and by is a better home awaiting in the sky, in the sky.
Many people seem to have really grown to hate Bioshock Infinite, and while as you can see I agree it isn't as good as the original Bioshock, it certainly has its merits. Though the act of playing it isn't quite as enjoyable as Bioshock, and Columbia comes up short of Rapture's greatness, the story of Infinite is not only more personal and emotional, but is told in a much more interesting way. When you take a step back and look at these two games, it's clear Bioshock is much more of a complete package. Everything about Bioshock is outstanding, whereas the parts of Infinite where it's a first-person shooter leave much to be desired. There are very few story-driven shooters that can match the quality of these two games, but between the two, Bioshock comes out on top.
Was a man sent to kill, or a slave? A man chooses. A slave obeys. Come in. Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?